President has an ill wife and a sick daughter, so you're stuck with me. I'm Jim Tedman, and I'm director of the Flagler Forum, and delighted that you're here tonight. It was 2 years ago this week that we closed the 2020 series of Flagler Forum talks, wondering when we would meet again, because the next day the NBA closed its season, and the United States closed just about everything. In the 2 years that have followed, we've all learned about social distancing, hot spots, masks, Zooming, and isolation. It's more than appropriate, then, that we meet tonight with vision on our minds. Our speaker this evening is Andrea Barnet, author of the celebrated book Visionary Women, in which she turns her sharp eye as a historian back on the lives of four heroic women: scientists Jane Goodall and Rachel Carson, the creator of the sustained food movement, Alice Waters, and social activist Jane Jacobs. With her skills as a journalist, Barnet conveys lessons from the lives of these four pioneering women on the world today, with a sharp focus on how their lives, their energies, and their vision are influencing our future. The message is clear. For readers and for our audience tonight, meeting these women will help us understand how people with a vision can change society by pursuing their dreams. Each of them immerse themselves in their very distinct environments and let their eyes lead the way. Of the many lessons they teach us, the most potent may be pay attention. Andrea Barnet grew up in Boston, graduated from Harvard, and attended graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania. For 25 years, she's been a writer for the New York Times Book Review, has written for the Smithsonian, Harper's Bazaar, Elle, and Architecture Digest magazines. She's written two books: Visionary Women, which was a finalist in the Penn Bogart competition in 2019, and her second book was The Women of Bohemian Greenwich Village in Harlem from 1913 to 1930, which was shortlisted for the esteemed Lambda Literary Award. She's traveled widely. In 2010, she was the director's guest in writing at Civitella Ranieri in Italy. She splits her time between the Hudson Valley in New York City and her daughter in San Francisco. She lives in Hudson Valley in New York, wherever she may be, with her husband, Kit White, who is with us tonight. As in the past, we're grateful for our sponsors, Casa Monica and Leonard's Photography. We're grateful for your presence, and we're particularly grateful for our guest speaker, Andrea Barnet.
Let's see if I did a lecture this morning and I think no one could hear me. Hello. Thank you so much, Jim, for having me here. Thank you to Anna Gilbert, who has choreographed this, not only this whole day, but has been working, I think, for weeks. Thank you to our student panelists, to faculty panelists, and thank you to St. Augustine. 3 days ago, my husband and I left New England. There was still snow on the ground. It was freezing. And so if there are any lapses tonight, it's because I'm still in a swoon because of this incredible weather. So beautiful here. I'm going to start by telling you a little about the origin story of the book, and then I will talk about all four women. The book began with a conversation I was having with a friend. The other thing I just wanted to say is that the photographs I'm going to show you, they're not really calibrated to my talk. I just wanted all of you to be able to envision what they look like. So I will flick them rather randomly, but you don't have to worry about whether they are going with what I'm saying. I'll try to keep the woman I'm talking about in front of you. I also want to say it's a little frightening to see one's own face that huge on the screen. So the book began with a conversation I was having with a friend, and I realized that there were four quite remarkable women, each of whom in interestingly similar and adjacent ways had changed the way we think about the world. Rachel Carson, who in 1962, at age 55, had written Silent Spring, which gave birth to the environmental movement and absolutely changed the way we think about chemical poisons in the environment. Jane Jacobs, in her 40s, in 1961, she saved Greenwich Village from the wrecking ball. Robert Moses intended to level all of Greenwich Village and put up high-rise housing towers, and she single-handedly organized the neighborhood against him. He did many other things, and she also wrote an audacious little book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And the book really gave rise to the historic preservation movement, which all of you who live here can appreciate how important old buildings were. Before that, there wasn't sort of a professed value to old neighborhoods and old buildings, and she made the argument. The third is Jane Goodall, who at age 26 in 1960 discovered chimps using tools completely overnight, changing our idea about animals and the relationship to humans, and sort of proved how close humans are to chimpanzees. And the fourth is Alice Waters, who in 1965, on a semester abroad in France, fell in love with French everything, French cuisine, French culture, and came back to Berkeley, and a few years later started Chez Panisse, which was really the first restaurant in America dedicated to local organic food. And she really gave birth to the sustainable food movement. And, you know, as kind of proof of how extraordinary that is, my husband's family is from a small town in West Virginia. And even in this little small rural town in West Virginia, there's a farm-to-table restaurant, which is all Alice's, part of what Alice started. So one of the things about all of these women, besides changing the way we think about the world, all had been uncredentialed outsiders. Two of them, Jane Jacobs and Jane Goodall, didn't even have college degrees. All were preservationists, green thinkers before the idea of green or eco had even entered our collective vocabulary. Though untrained, all waded into the field in their respective fields, got their hands physically and dirty and literally dirty, and spoke truth to power. In this case, because it was the early 60s, male power, and prevailed. Because they were outsiders, all brought a very fresh perspective to their respective fields, and all, interestingly, had their breakthrough moments just at the beginning of the 1960s, which was the beginning of a sort of new cultural moment. So I thought that's where I started, and I thought it's really interesting. There's so many parallels, even though they're in four different fields. Because they had their breakthrough moments in the 60s, I assumed that was my fifth character. But the more I began to read, the more I realized really it was the era of the 50s that was my fifth character, because all of them were responding and pushing back against the values and the priorities of the 1950s. So, 1950s, what were those? 1950s, as many of you may remember, was an era of Cold War fears and conformity. There was a kind of love affair with technology. The great legislative monument of the era was the interstate highway system. Its rationale was to be able to whiz a whole new class of businessmen out to these newly minted suburbs, but also more gravely to move troops and nuclear weapons in and out of cities should nuclear war break out. So it was a very schizophrenic decade in that, on the one hand, people were terrified of nuclear Armageddon. There were nuclear tests going on all over the world, particularly in Russia and the United States. But there was also incredible prosperity. Because of the atom bomb had won the war, and so physicists and chemists were king. We were sort of giddy with our own prosperity. The Henry Ford's idea of mass production had been extended to housing. William Levitt started making prefab houses and putting up full towns of matching houses. McDonald's followed suit with mechanized food, with fast food. Um, Interstate highway system was tearing up cities. So there was all of which is to say the the culture was really in thrall of technology, and there was the sense that technological innovation, and particularly chemical innovation, would be able to solve all problems of the world. Um, so one of the things that was a byproduct of the war had been chemical pesticides. DDT was discovered during the war. It seemed like a miracle. It killed lice on contact, so it was sprayed. It was used in the trenches. There was a typhus epidemic in Naples. Planes went overhead over the city, and the typhus epidemic was beaten back. Um, it was being sprayed over sports stadiums before big sports, and there was the sense that this thing was something very wonderful. And in fact, the inventor of DDT got a Nobel Prize. It was in 1947. Um, it went without saying. Oh, well, so pesticides were going to this new technological world was going to streamline everything. Pesticides would kill bugs. Synthetic fertilizers would boost efficiency of farming. Pharmaceuticals would quickly fatten animals so that they could be brought to market. Um, uh, Cities could be plowed. Parts of cities could be plowed over so that to accommodate the highway and the car. All this kind of top-down thinking was everyone believed was the wave of the future. It went without saying that this sort of brawny new world was a male world, even though women in the 40s during the war had worked in air and munitions factories. They'd even been jet pilots. They had done all kinds of men's work. As soon as the war was over, the GIs returned. All the women were fired. They were sent to the suburbs to be good consumers, to take care of their children, um, and they were out of work. Um, and so it sort of goes. So the question was, in this at the end of the 50s, what was it about four women, uncredentialed, um, in their fields that was to carry such weight, and how is it they accomplished what they did? Um, so that became my quest. And one of the things I started to realize as I started reading was all of them had a different approach to their work, a different methodology. Because they hadn't had training, they didn't know what they were looking for, so they looked very carefully. They were keenly observant, they were discoverers. Um, Jane Jacobs walked, and I'll tell you more about her, but she walked through New York City. She moved to New York City. She walked every block of the city, sort of watching and looking at the patterns. Um, Architecture at that moment was based on the modernist canon. It was highly theoretical. Um, um, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Let me just give you a picture. Okay, so this is Rachel Carson. And I'm going to show you all Rachel, and then this is Rachel at college. This is Rachel a little later in her life. She's being interviewed by Eric Severoid. I'll tell you about that. And this is Rachel at the end of her life. But maybe I'll go back to. Okay. Um, so these women they had a different methodology. They were highly observant. They trusted their senses. They trusted their intuition. They trusted the lived and felt. Um, it's what Bill McKibben says, thinking with all your senses. They lived, they went into the world physically and reported on what they saw rather than relying on theory, because they had no theory. Um, Carson, I'm going to tell you a little about Carson, because she was the first person to recognize the connectivity of the living world. Carson grew up desperately poor in a small four-room cabin in a little town outside of Pittsburgh. Her father was a ne'er-do-well. He couldn't hold a job. Her mother was educated and thus very disappointed with the reduced circumstances that she found herself in. The first two children were high school dropouts. The son was someone that was described by a friend as a man who would steal chickens from his own mother. The daughter dropped out of high school and married a local boy. She got pregnant, and as soon as she did, her husband bolted, left town, never seen again. So she moved back into the Carsons. And so Rachel, who was the youngest child, was her mother's last hope. So she showered Rachel with attention, and luckily Rachel um, answered her in kind. She was a brilliant student. She rose to the top of her class during high school and was awarded a scholarship to private college in Pittsburgh. The Carsons had no money, so they took out, Maria Carson sold the family china, sold apples. They took out some loans. Um, Rachel once again distinguished herself in college. Like all college students, she'd gone thinking she wanted to be a writer, but as soon as she got to college, she had to take a requisite biology class. And to her surprise, she fell in love with biology. She fell in love with science, which kind of made sense because she'd spent her life in a very solitary way out in the woods with her mother. Her mother kind of felt that nature was close to godliness, taught her the names of every wildflower and every bird. So there was a great attention to the importance of the natural world. So Rachel distinguished herself in the biology class, and her teacher got her a fellowship to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, which was on Cape Cod. Rachel had never seen the sea, and she got there. It was the summer between sophomore and junior year, and she just fell under the spell of the mysteries of the sea. She was still very socially awkward, pathologically shy. So she didn't really mingle so much with the rest of the people there. She spent her time walking the beach and staring into tide pools and really focusing on all the sea life. Looking at crabs coming out of the sand, watching the waves, watching the way the sea foam would tumble along the beach. This would become her subject. So she finished college and got a scholarship to graduate school. She decided she wanted to pursue science, which is very, very difficult for a woman at the time. But she finished she did a master's in zoology, but at the same time, it was during the Depression. The family, no one had any work, and so she was also holding down two part-time jobs as she was studying. So she was supporting five family members, her sisters, two children, her father, her mother. She got her degree and then decided she wanted to get a PhD, and then very soon after had to quit because it was just too much to be supporting all these people. Very difficult during the Depression, needless to say, for a woman to get work since men were the first priority. I think it's easy to forget how few opportunities existed for women at that moment. Only 3% of women in the country could be doctors. Most medical schools did not admit women. The same with law school. Only 6% of women were lawyers. You couldn't, if you were married, you had to quit most jobs. Like if you were a stewardess, you had to quit a job. You could be a secretary, but it was very hard to be, even as a scientist, even as a trained scientist, you couldn't go out into the field. Your job, usually the best you could do would be to teach high school science. So there were huge odds against her. Um, so in order to make ends meet, she got a part-time job, and she felt very, very lucky about that. It was for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it was 2 days a week. But she discovered that there was kind of a silver lining in that with the extra time, she could try to write articles about the sea, which she started to do. She sold them to the Baltimore Sun and other places, and she was able to cobble together enough money to support her family. And one of her articles, it turns out, was so good that her boss said, "You really, this is way too good for a government publication. You really should send it to a national magazine." She sent it to the Atlantic. Atlantic bought it immediately, paid her, 3 times what she got in a week, and she was off as a journalist. So for the next 10 or 15 years, she started writing articles about the sea. And Rachel was a very beautiful and lyrical writer, and she was able to explain the unseen workings of the sea with a kind of poetry that was compelling for people. Her second book was serialized in the New Yorker, and people thought of her as a nature writer and as someone who could describe very complicated processes in a way they could understand. She never intended to write Silent Spring. It wasn't the kind of thing she was doing, but she'd been interested in pesticides since the 40s when she first got her job, the Fish and Wildlife Service. And sometime in 1957, she got a letter from a friend of hers who said, there's a big lawsuit that's going on in Long Island. At that point, the government was doing 3 state spray campaigns with DDT, and they were just blanketing states to get rid of all kinds of bugs, mosquitoes. And Rachel had already looked into pesticides a bit, and some of the findings that scientists within the government had found were not looking good. She tried to sell a story to Reader's Digest in the late 40s. They only wanted feel-good stories, so she sort of dropped it. So 1957 came around, and she wrote to the New Yorker. She wrote to E.B. White, actually, who wrote Charlotte's Web, and said, "There's a really important story. These citizens in Long Island are suing the government, saying they don't want this rain of poison raining down on their land. They have organic vegetable garden, which is actually something unusual, and so the lawsuit's going to take place. Someone should cover it." And E.B. White wrote her back and said, "I think you should cover it. I can promise you we'll at least run a story in the New Yorker." So she began Silent Spring. Rachel was an incredible researcher. One of the things about Silent Spring is there's 60 pages of notes. It's only a 200-page book in terms of its text. She talked to entomologists, she talked to cancer specialists, she talked to people across the board. And one of her gifts was a lot of the information that she presented in Silent Spring was already known, but it was in siloed specialties. Individual doctors and researchers knew one aspect, and she was able to knit the whole story together and make people see how dangerous pesticides were, and write it in a way that everyday people could understand. She, even in the early years, Rachel had noticed that when people wrote about the natural world, they tended to categorize. They tended to describe each creature as a discrete object. And yet when she walked the beach or was in the woods, what she noticed was everything seemed to be connected to everything else. Looking into a tide pool, she'd see a mussel that was attached to a rock or seaweed, and she'd see something else, a barnacle attached to the mussel, and so on. And what she began to see was that there was no way to understand any single creature. You had to understand what its environment was, which is an ecological way of thinking, and which was a completely new way of thinking. Up until then, the example I give is paramecium, which is a little speck of dust. There's no way you can see a paramecium without looking at a drop of pond water. So you can't really understand what a paramecium is without pond water. And what Rachel was able to do was to make people understand that everything was connected to everything else, and there was an interdependency. And that in order to understand the world, you had to understand the systems that supported the living creature. This idea of interconnection very much came into play with Silent Spring. One of the things in her research that she had learned, and there were many shocking stories, was in the University of Michigan, they'd been testing DDT. They'd been spraying for Dutch elm disease, which was a blight that was moving through the United States, killing trees. And they were spraying every spring. They'd spray the trees, and they'd noticed that all the birds and the robins, and particularly the robins, would die at the time of the spraying. But one of the things that was puzzling and quite alarming was The next spring, this had happened in the spring, but by the next spring, there were more robins dying than it was way after the spring. And one of the things they realized was the DDT had coated the leaves had fallen to the ground as they do in fall. All through the winter, earthworms had been eating the leaf litter. The worms had become toxic, and so the next spring, when robins flew in, they ate the toxic worms and started to die. The other thing that was alarming was that they many of the birds weren't laying eggs, and those that did lay the eggs, they weren't hatching. And when they did biopsies of the birds, they discovered DDT in their testes and in their ovaries. So what what Rachel was seeing was that DDT was moving up the food chain. It wasn't just killing bugs, but it was moving up the food chain to kill birds and fish and ultimately to sicken humans. She began to, when she talked to cancer specialists, although it wasn't yet well known, there was a clear association between DDT and other pesticides and leukemia and other cancers. And what she saw was that DDT and other chemicals were doing the same kind of thing as nuclear radiation, which was changing the genetic makeup of all these living creatures. So at the time, as I said before, the country was terrified of nuclear Armageddon. Every single day in the newspaper, there were radiation reports. And so when Rachel wrote about DDT, she really likened it to nuclear radiation. It did the same things. It was long lasting, it entered the food chain, and it caused genetic alterations and ultimately perhaps killed killed parts of the food chain. So while this was happening, so Silent Spring came out in 1962. It was a shocking book. It was a bestseller. People were horrified to find out that this chemical that was in their floor wax, that they sprayed their bed sheets with, that were sprayed on the inside of hospital kitchens and school kitchens, was this toxic and dangerous. At the same time that Carson was writing this, Jane Jacobs, who was living in Greenwich Village, who was writing about cities, was seeing the same kind of interconnectivity. Jane Jacobs, let me show you what she looked like. This is, by the way, this is Rachel Carson being interviewed by Eric Severide, who had been a war journalist. He was on CBS. In those days, there were only 3 networks, and so everyone saw Rachel testifying about the danger of pesticides. And the thing that's interesting is that the chemical companies had mounted a smear campaign, calling her communist, a subversive, an hysterical woman. And when she appeared, she was poised, she was articulate, she was very, very measured in what she said, and it was clear she wasn't a zealot. And here she is, right before she died, testifying before Senate subcommittee on pesticides. All the time that Rachel was writing Silent Spring, she was dying of cancer, but she told no one except a few close friends, because she was so afraid the chemical companies would say, oh, well, this woman is only interested in this because she's dying of cancer. So on this day, as she was testifying, she's wearing a wig because of chemo, she's bald. Her spine is so riddled with fractures, she can barely walk. She spoke for an hour, and out of this came eventually the EPA. Okay, so on to Jacobs. This is Jane Jacobs as a young woman. And there Jane Jacobs is in Greenwich Village at the White Horse Tavern. So Jane Jacobs had moved to New York City, to Greenwich Village, again at the end of the Depression. She wanted to be a journalist. She had finished high school but gone no further. She'd taken one stenography class. She was looking for jobs as a writer. That wasn't happening. So she started to write little freelance articles. She'd go to various specialized neighborhoods like the Flower District, the Fur District, and write these pieces, and Vogue picked them up, which was kind of amazing. One thing led to another. She talked her way into Architectural Forum because she was really very interested in architecture. She loved the city. So Jane, one of her first jobs at Architectural Forum, at the time, there was a sense that cities were in crisis and that the only way to save cities was through um, full scale, large scale intervention to knock down whole neighborhoods and in their place put up high rise housing towers, those, anonymous monolithic towers we see in some cities, on the edge of cities, sometimes with a windy plaza around them, sometimes with a little grass. So Jane Jacobs was sent to Philadelphia at the time. Robert Moses and Ed Bacon in Philadelphia, Robert Moses in New York, was practicing this sort of new thing, which was called urban renewal, which was knock down the buildings, old neighborhoods, put up these towers, thread highways through, and the city will be fixed. So Jacobs had no particular feeling about this. She was interested in what urban renewal might be, so she took the train to Philadelphia and was met by Ed Bacon, who was a very courtly man. And he said, okay, first I'm going to show you one of the old neighborhoods that we're taking down, and then I'm going to show you what we've done. So he took her to this neighborhood that to Jacob's eyes looked very vital. There were people popping in and out of shops. There were all kinds of different shops together. There were kids playing on the sidewalk. There were groups of mothers talking, and it seemed very lively to her. And so he said, okay, well, this, it's very chaotic. This is a real problem. And so he walked her a couple of blocks to this lot with super blocks, with these anonymous, faceless super blocks. And she stood and looked at it. And he said, look at the beautiful symmetry. And she stood and looked at it and she said, where are the people? There was not a soul in sight. Here were these towers and no people. And he said, oh, they don't appreciate, how symmetrical and orderly it is. And she thought to herself, something is wrong with this idea. The human quotient has been completely left out. This is all based on theory. So she went back to New York and told her colleagues she was going to write that these new urban renewal towers were a complete, utter failure. They said, no, no, you can't do that. These are men who are saving these cities. This is the whole new way. And she said, I have to. So she wrote this article, which very much pushed against the grain. The article was immediately, they had never gotten so many letters of praise at Architectural Forum because of this, of her article. And it led to another article, and then pretty soon it led to a book. And the theme of her book was going to be what made cities tick, what was working in cities. So because she'd had no architectural training, and because she didn't really know what she was looking for, she started to walk New York City. She walked every block, trying to analyze, what made some blocks feel inviting and lively, what others felt menacing, what made some parks work, why others were kind of scabby with disuse, what was the role of the sidewalk, what was the role of this and that. And she not only went through New York, but that she visited other cities, and she began to get a sense of what she thought was really made cities alive. And one day, she had a bit of an epiphany, which was she'd gone up to Harlem with someone, with a local pastor who wanted her to see the neighborhood. In Harlem, of course, a lot of it had been destroyed, and this was an old street. And she saw this group of people. They'd hot wired a TV to a pole, and they were watching a ball game. And there were mothers, fathers, kids running around, dogs. Everyone was drinking, howling, having fun. And she had this sort of momentary epiphany. She thought, it's not the way the buildings look, it's the social fabric. And that cities had an ecology all of their own. And the ecology was the way the people lived on the block, in the houses. And that in a way, the people were like oysters in an oyster bed or prairie dogs in the prairie. And then if you ignored the street life, the life of the people, you killed the city. And there was a kind of fragility to it, the same fragility that Rachel Carson had talked about in The Natural World, that you might not think a bug was important, but that bug might be the only food for a certain fish, and that fish might be the only food for a certain bird, and that bird might be the only bird that moved a certain seed to a place and that planted, and that it was all a web of interconnections, and that cities were equally interconnected and and inter intertwined, and that if you knocked out a whole neighborhood, you killed, not only did you kill the street life, but you killed the connective tissue that connected one neighborhood to the next, that allowed it to flow into the next, or one block into the next. We all sort of know this, when you're walking in a lively town like St. Augustine, and you suddenly get to a parking lot, an empty parking lot, something about it goes dead, and you kind of hurry to the next place where there's some kind of street light. And one of the things Jacobs was saying was, one cavernous supermarket on the ground floor of a tower does not replace 30 individual shops, which have create different people come. Jacobs also talked about the need for diversity in neighborhoods, which was the same thing that Carson had talked about. Um, a wetland that's really healthy has all kinds of different creatures, and they're all sort of forming to make a kind of web. And in a city, a diverse neighborhood, it wasn't just black and white and brown, it was diversity of uses, so that it was important to have a butcher next to a dry cleaner, next to a repair shop, next to a bar, next to a restaurant. And that, because if you had a diversity of uses, there were different people on the street at different times, and it made it lively. So there was no time where you walked out into an empty street and felt in danger. She called this eyes on the street, which is that, in crowds of people, you do feel safe. Um, she also talked about the fact that, like the natural world, evolution it was really important to let a city evolve organically rather than to these sort of top-down interventions. And my husband and I went to the ice plant yesterday and had lunch. What an amazing place to be. It was an ice house, and now it's a fabulous little restaurant. And she talked about the fact that stables became um, theaters, and industrial lofts became places where people lived, and that if you left the old buildings, there was some sort of intimate human fabric. It would grow other enterprises as they were needed. And it wasn't just that only old buildings were good, but that every neighborhood needed some human scale old buildings to kind of ground it. And, it's no surprise that people flock to a place like St. Augustine because there are these marvelous old buildings. It's not a strip mall, where everything feels anonymous. Okay, so let me give you a few more of Jacobs, and then I better move on because I'm too big a talker. All right, so there she is. She was a voracious reader. She's reading The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, just for light reading. And this is at when she saved her neighborhood from the wrecking ball. She found some corruption. This developer had paid off the city, and she's now holding the documents proving it. She not only saved her own neighborhood, but Robert Moses wanted to run a superhighway right through Washington Square Park, which was the only green space in Lower Manhattan. And she was very clever. I was telling some of the people today that she was such a tactician, and she knew that she had been fighting at the Central Park. In Central Park, there was a restaurant, and Robert Moses wanted to put a big paved parking lot, and it was where it was a playground for young children. The mothers in the neighborhood brought their children. So on the days the bulldozer arrived, Jane had them line up with all the kids in their strollers, and so the guys in the earth-moving machines were not going to plow into little children in their strollers. And the press was there. They took all these pictures, and the project died because it was so politically, insensitive. And so Jane was really good at organizing not only her neighborhood, but it turned out many neighborhoods in the United States. Okay. Now we're going to move on to Jane Goodall. So this idea, the theme of tonight is interconnectivity, and this and the fact that that there was no way to understand the world without understanding the larger systems that support living things, which is really systems thinking. It was a very, very new idea. It was a kind of paradigm shift. Jane Goodall also didn't go to college, had no training in primatology, but she loved animals. She sold her dollhouse to buy a dog. She had, 20 little pets in her backyard. She was just fixated on animals. And she always told her family when she grew up, she was going to move to Africa and live with wild animals. It was a household of women. They said, "Of course you are." They didn't contradict her. At the end of her high school, she decided not to go to college. Um, she had a friend who lived in Kenya, and her friend invited her to come for a visit. So Jane took a waitressing job, doing 2 or 3 shifts, not enough money to pay for passage to Kenya, to Nairobi, and met her friend. And as soon as she got there, she said, love it here. I really want to stay. And she knew that Louis Leakey, who was already a renowned primatologist, anthropologist, was in Nairobi, and then he was head of a small museum. So she made a cold call and said, "I really want to meet you, and I want to see the museum." And he said, "Okay, by all means, come." Jane was, as you see, very, very beautiful. And 3 hours later, after her visit, she'd been hired as a secretary. We should add that Leakey was a bit of a skirt chaser, so he, I think, had other ideas besides secretarial work, but leave that to your imagination. Um, Jane, Leakey asked Jane if she wanted to go with him for one of his summer digs with his wife Mary, and it was really grueling conditions. They'd go to the Serengeti. It was desert conditions, really hot, no baths. They had, I think, a bowl of water each day to wash with. Um, you know, Pretty reduced food. And one of the things Leakey noticed was Jane had this incredible quietness about her and incredible patience. And he had been looking for someone to do a study of chimps in the wild for quite a while. And there had been men who tried, but they'd gone with 25 manservants with guns. And of course, they weren't able to observe chimps in the wild because they caused such a ruckus in the jungle. And he started to think, well, maybe a woman would be better. And so, sort of against all odds, he was able to raise enough money to be able to send Jane. Jane had no training. She had no idea what she was looking for. Um, he was looking for behaviors in chimpanzees that resembled humans, thinking that this would help him understand what early primitive men looked like and acted like. So Jane arrived in Gombe, which was in this game preserve. And you can see how mountainous it was. And it was dense jungle. There were times where it rained, for 3 days straight, where the grass was higher than her head. She'd have to climb a tree to see where she was. Really, really arduous conditions. She was living in a tent, open tent. The only way she was allowed to go was with her mother. Her mother agreed to go. She had incredible patience for the first couple months. She wasn't able to get anywhere close to chimpanzee. And as time went by, she'd sit really quietly and watch. And because she didn't know any better, she started giving them names so she could remember when she could identify them, who was who. And because just sort of intuitively, she was looking for relations, she was looking for bonds, she was looking for some ways in which they were connected. And she began to see that, in fact, they were very complex and they were very interconnected. There was one chimpanzee that every time he saw a certain female chimpanzee, he'd rush up, put out his hand, and or ask for her hand and kiss her paw. There were some chimpanzees who seemed to be really good friends. Every time they saw each other, they went into a bear hug. There were feuds, there was jealousy, and she began to see that they had a whole constellation of emotions that was as complex as humans, and that in order to understand the chimpanzees, which up until then people thought of them, or primatologists thought of them as sort of mechanized as animals, like mechanized as a clock, that they only operated by instinct. They had no intent, they had no personalities, they really had um, no sentience. And what she was seeing was just the opposite, that they could plan, they had friendships, they had love, some were better mothers. And then one day she witnessed two chimpanzees who were using tools, had always been what anthropologists said separated men from animals, was animals, men, men and women could use their logic to use tools and solve problems. And here were chimpanzees using tools to, to, to do what they wanted to do, which was to eat termites. She sent a message to Louis Leakey, who's back in Nairobi. He was shocked and thrilled, and said, the world will never be the same. And in fact, it was the beginning of a whole paradigm shift in primatology. Um, so, but my point in telling you all of this is that she, what she saw was the same interconnectedness in the animal world as Jane Jacobs had seen in the urban world, as Rachel Carson had seen in the life of natural world, and that again they were seeing the world in terms of ecology, systems that sustain life. Um, Let me give you a few more pictures of. Here she is. This took months, but after a while, she would sit in the bush, and when chimpanzees looked over at her, she would pretend she was a chimpanzee, and she'd scratch the earth to pretend she was eating. And she got so that the chimpanzees would actually take food from her hand. She had no weapon. A chimpanzee is strong enough to rip a human being's arm off in a nanosecond, but she was so gentle and sort of she didn't project anything threatening, and she gradually won their trust. You can also see how young she was. She was 27, and that's her tent. That's what she lived in for months. And there she is, the Jane we all see these days. She she's 84 or 85 now. She still is on the road 300 days a year advocating for sustainable habitats and for chimpanzees. One of the other things about connectiveness is she realized that it wasn't enough to save chimpanzees. Who would care about chimpanzees? It was important to understand that in order to save their habitat, the forest where they lived, you had to keep people from cutting down the trees. And in order to keep them from cutting down the trees, you had to give them enough work so that they had enough money to do other things, to buy fuel. And so that there was an interconnection between the animals and the human world, and that this was all part of the whole web of life. And so she spends now her time talking to corporate, people and governments to try to save communities, habitats, chimpanzees, and she has a youth program. Okay, now to Alice Waters, our 60s girl. Good, yeah. So Alice Waters was also very inadvertently discovered the importance of interconnectivity between food and farming. She started out loving food. She opened her restaurant, hoping to create a place where good food, where good friends could meet. She just wanted to make the food that she tasted in France, which was so good. She watched Julia Child on TV, worked her way through every cookbook. And one of the things she had begun to notice was when she went to the supermarket and bought the vegetables on the shelves, they looked really beautiful, but they had no taste. And so when she cooked, the dishes did not taste as she remembered them in France. Meanwhile, friends of hers, hippie friends, were beginning to grow their own gardens organically, and they'd bring vegetables and things to the back door of the restaurant. And she realized that those vegetables tasted so much better, and the meals that the dishes she prepared had so much more flavor. And she realized then the connectivity between wholesome, healthy food raised in a sustainable manner and in a responsible manner really changed the nutritional value, but also the taste. And so she kind of arrived at the idea of raising things organically in a backhanded way. She just was looking for the sensual pleasure of great food. So she saw that that there was a connection between good food and good farming, and that good farming had to do with the whole way we treat the earth. Okay, I'm almost done. I'm going to give you a few more pictures of her. I'm sorry, I've really abbreviated Alice. Okay, there she is. Alice is responsible for the first person to bring mescaline lettuce to the United States. She smuggled in some seeds from friends in France, came back to Berkeley, and planted them. Of course, now and every restaurant in America has mescaline lettuce. There she is. The way she would talk about cooking is she'd wait to see how the ingredients were going to connect. She's thinking about what she's going to cook and tasting an herb. And she started, this is a primary school in Berkeley. She started a program where primary school kids were growing their own food as a way of teaching them ecology and respect for nature. And one of the things she turned it into a verdant garden. It's part of their curriculum. And one of the things she discovered is kids will eat vegetables if you've grown them themselves. And there the kids are with their signs. So, just to finish, my book, though a group biography of 4 women, was really a group biography of a paradigm shift, a change in the way people looked at the world. History is usually told as a progression of events, one after another, but the real needle moves with a change of consciousness. And each of these women, in her own field, catalyzed a change in consciousness. And what happened was, across all those fields, it really changed the way people approach the world. Instead of counting and categorizing, which is what the sort of men of the 1950s have been doing, they were mapping relationships, which is really the mark of an eco-literate society, is to look at the connections and the relationships. Where the men were seeing hierarchies and separation, these women were seeing unities and connections. The world is a holistic system. Instead of mathematical abstractions, wiping out a whole urban neighborhood or wiping out all the starfish in a certain place, they were seeing living communities, which is when you don't look at it so abstractly, you think in a different way. Instead of sweeping generalizations, they were looking at fine-grained details. They had a different timeline. The corporate model is always short-term, maximize gain. They were looking for long-term sustainability of a city neighborhood, of a city in general, of obviously the environment. Um, um, they were they were looking for solutions that were organic and local and came sort of from the bottom up, rather than enforcing them from the top down. Um, and one of the things that all of them, they were all extremely articulate. And one of the things they all understood is, in order to change minds, you have to win hearts. And so the way they wrote was very personal. They added personal anecdotes, which is really a no-no in any technical subject. Jane Goodall wrote about chimpanzees in a novelistic way, not only giving them names, but recreating the dramas, so that people cared about chimpanzees enough to think about it. Jane Jacobs wrote about cities. She loved cities, and she thought they were marvelous places, and she wrote about them, the things that made them great. So they understood that if you personalized it, you still doing really careful research, but if you gave people a hook in, they'd be more likely to care and to change things. They also sort of said, this sort of new technocratic way of thinking is not working, and you can change it. You can understand this stuff. It's not rocket science, and you can. They were all sort of advocating for kind of grassroots activism, and especially Carson, who said, we can all understand these pesticides, and you need to call your congressman, and you need to do this and that. Um, so they were change agents. They changed the face of the possible. They were passionate, unapologetic about what they cared about. They had a kind of clear moral compass. They were interested in community rights rather than business rights, in making the world a better place in the long term rather than some short-term gain. None of them were egomaniacs. In fact, both, Carson and Jacobs really didn't like the limelight, didn't like publicity. They just wanted to do their work. Um, I'm just going to finish with reading something by the poet farmer Wendell Berry. Um, Wendell Berry once said, "We are divided as a culture between exploitation and nurture. The standard of the exploiter is efficiency. The standard of the nurturer is care. The exploiter's goal is money, profit. The nurturer's goal is health of her land, her family, her community, her country. The exploiter typically serves an institution. The nurturer serves land, household, community, place. The exploiter thinks in terms of numbers, quantities, hard facts. The nurturer in terms of character, quality, kind. And I would say Rachel Carson, Jane Jacobs, Jane Goodall, and Alice Waters were all nurturers, and our world is richer for them. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to invite Professor Kelly Enright from the History Department and three students to come up and ask the first round of questions. And in the meantime, let me thank our sign language translators here who just been working very, very hard. So you know, the camera is catching the back of your heads, which will all be on, we have a website for the forum, and we can manage to get the pictures of all the speakers and the speeches that they give. So, and the translators will also be seeing on that. So they're doing double duty. I'll invite you to prepare your own questions, and we'll go through the first round of questions with the Professor Enright and the students. Introduce yourselves, and then ask your questions, okay? Indeed.
Thank you. Now I can tell the time. Thank you so much for your talk. It's so interesting to see the way that you connect for women that we're not really from the same fields. And what was making me think about was the way in which we talk about nature as in different ways. So we have nature that's maybe our backyards, here like the nature that's at home, and then the nature that's out there, or wilderness, or national parks, or something like that. Um, and I wonder in your work how you think these women. Okay, sorry. Um, sorry. So, how you think these women have contributed to the way in which we define nature, and also who and what makes up an environmentalist? Because the women that you chose combine various things that sometimes we don't think of together: chemicals, food, um, animals, and urbanization. So it really makes me wonder how you would define an environmentalist and how you think these women have um, contributed to our definition of that.
Good question. Um, I think one of the things that's really interesting is that um, Jane Jacobs, who was really writing about urban life and urban fabric, was talking about natural systems in the same way that the others were talking about the natural world, sort of saying that we only have one system, and that is to follow natural processes, and that they don't end at the edge of the city or the end of the suburbs, but that but if we understand, if we look at nature and we mimic its processes, that we will find solutions. And there's a woman named Janine Benyus, and she's been gathering together engineers who you don't think of necessarily as environmentalists. And they've been studying things in the natural world to see if they can come up with solutions to technical problems. And for instance, an abalone shell those many, many layers of color is stronger than steel. And so they're trying to figure out how to use this knowledge of what those many layers in the abalone shell, how steel could be made in perhaps a more natural way. Looking at burdocks and that burdocks are like Velcro, looking at the shape of leaves and using them to design the wings of airplanes and to make them more aerodynamic. So I think rather than separating nature and culture, these women were the first ones to say we are all interconnected and that if we really want solutions to our world, we're not separate from it. We need to look to those systems and those patterns, perhaps for solutions. So to me, that is the kind of inadvertent lesson of these women is that they were really advocating for preserving those systems because those systems are what sustain us wherever we are.
Great, thank you.
So I'm Presley Johnson, and I'm a junior public history major at Flagler, and I'm also from Dallas, Texas. And so I really enjoyed reading your book and then learning about all the different women. I'd known of two of them, and I did not know about Jane Jacobs or Alice Waters. It's really interesting to see that. But I was curious how you came across each woman's story and then how you decided to do the group biography.
Well, one of the things people often ask me is, what other women did you consider? And of course, the the Feminine Mystique, which was published in 1963, which ushered in the women's movement in so many ways. It was the same thing, a sweeping social movement, changed the way we think about women, outsider. But I realized that Betty Friedan was trying to blow up a system that was profoundly unjust to women. And all the other women were trying to preserve systems that existed that were in peril. So the others were green thinkers, and Friedan wasn't. And so I was looking for women who were, those four women were green thinkers, even Jacobs. They were outsiders. They were had their breakthrough moments, as I said, in the early 60s. They were fearless, courageous. They spoke truth to power. Rachel Carson was accused of being a communist and subversive when her book came out. Jacobs was completely pilloried by the architectural press. Each one of them had so much pushback. So their characters were they were really single-minded about their work. And I know there are many other visionary women, but this little constellation is not that they're the only women, but it's interesting to me that it was at this moment because it really says a lot about what was going on in the culture at large. And for the first time, women, up until then, women couldn't have a credit card without a male cosigner. Many states, women couldn't be on jury duty. There were so many restrictions on women, and these women kind of broke that glass ceiling. So those, and also the fact that they are icons. I didn't want an unknown woman. I wanted a woman who'd really changed our world. And I know there are many more, but.
It's great, thank you. I'm Elena de Avila. I'm also a Flagler student. My major is political science, and I hold two minors. One is philosophy, and the other one is law. And my question for you is that, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. Oh, wait. In your preface, you spoke on how these prophetic women moved and inspired you so greatly. And I was curious on how exactly you implemented the wisdom you gained from diving so deep into the minds of such bravely green women, and how you kind of saw this book impacting the reader.
That's a great question. Well, one thing was, Jacobs talked about confirmation bias. She said, most of us have an opinion, and then we go out into the world and we collect the data that supports our opinion. And she said, I don't really know what I think. I go out into the world and I look at patterns, and once I begin to see certain patterns repeat themselves, I begin to think, that's what I that's there's something to that, and I form my conclusions. So when I was writing this, as I was reading all their work, I started looking for patterns, where places where there were parallels but also overlaps, and there were so many more than I when I started out, that I knew existed. And the more patterns, the more excited I got about weaving them together. And I was telling all of you earlier, I wrote each one as a discrete section, and then I went back, and it was a little bit like knitting. There were times where I'd kind of dropped a stitch, where there was a thematic thread where I hadn't carried it all the way through. And so it was really pattern recognition, and that's such a huge part of the way, people solve problems.
Hi, my name is Ray. I'm from Rockville, Maryland. I am currently a graphic design student here at Flagler, but I have a minor in environmental science. There was clearly so much research that went into writing this book. I was wondering, what was the biggest challenge in writing this group biography and intertwining all of these stories, and were there any unexpected difficulties that you ran into along the way in the research process and in the writing process?
It's a great question. When I was writing this book, I decided I didn't know whether I'd be able to make it work. I mean, I saw these sort of common themes, but I didn't know whether I could make it come alive. And I thought, well, I'm going to keep a diary, a little writer's journal. I didn't write every day. I'm going to see if, so that when I go off the rails and go off track and lose my way, I'm going to know later. I'm going to be able to look at it. So I wrote like every 2 weeks. And when I went back, when I finally finished the book 4 years later, I went back and read the journal, and it was the first year and a half. I am just fretting. Every single entry was like, I don't think this scene's going to work. I don't. It's not adding up. It's not. I was so worried all along that the commonalities, that I wasn't making it come to life, and so. There's so much more that can be said when you're writing about any one life, but in 4 lives, I had to choose very selectively in what I included. And one of the things I decided was that I would try to recreate their moments of epiphany and observation. And if I could animate those moments of real seeing, a vision where it was a different vision from what sort of the sort of received wisdom was, I would maybe be able to make what their achievements understandable. So that's one way I selected scenes, and sometimes I didn't write it chronologically. I'd start in the middle of a story and then flash back, and sometimes I would write for really many weeks and realize that I wasn't able to get back to where I needed to go, and so I'd have to scrap it and start in a new place. So I was lost in the woods a lot of the time. And it was about when I look back at the journal, sort of like after the second year, there begin to be little bits of light where I write to myself, I think, this is holding up. But I was really unsure because it was so ambitious, and there were such different fields that to find the common ground was fascinating and challenging, and it wasn't really till the last maybe year where I was really polishing it that I felt I was on solid ground. And also that you never know when to stop researching. There's just so much. And I was saying earlier that, there's maybe 2 paragraphs on the Beat Generation, which is really sort of just a moment in Jacob's story. But I read, 3 books about the Beat Generation in order to know enough to be able to distill it for the 3 paragraphs. So there's a lot of wasted time where you think, well, actually, I'm not going to be able to use this. So it was a slog, but ultimately really, really fascinating.
I think it came together beautifully, and I had a great time reading it.
Thank you.
Why don't we do one more round of questions, and then, West, if you get your questions ready, we have a few coming in. So that's it.
Sure. Excuse me. I wanted to ask a little bit more about, in particular, what you think is the female contribution. So you talk about how they were amateurs in a way, where they were observing without theories or methods when they go in. Um, and then it was really interesting what you just mentioned about Betty Friedan. So, and I write about and study some women earlier in time, 1920s, 1930s, in which they're not part of the establishment. Maybe they're married to these explorers and then they're off writing on their own in a very different way. And they often create some kind of recognition or power for their viewpoint, but within their gender norm of the
Right.
time. And so, how do you see maybe one or two of these women using the power within the role they're supposed to be playing in society in the time? And do any of them eventually kind of break out of that role? Or is the point that they're within this role and still having a voice?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I do think that there was their way of looking at the world was relational. It was about how different creatures relate to each other, and particularly how when Goodall was looking at the chimpanzees, she was seeing them as family, friend, all those things. That was a very female. She was seeing it if some chimpanzees felt left out, if some were well tended. So she was already biased in a way that we're acculturated. Women are acculturated to nurture and take care of of each other. So I think there was always that, and I think even Jacobs, she felt very protective about the community and the life of her street and her neighborhood. When her neighborhood was going to be knocked down, she knew, the butcher by first name. All it was living people. It wasn't an abstraction. I think that they particularized a lot of the issues so that it was part of their emotional life too to be trying to solve the questions. And I do think also they used, I mean, Jane Goodall definitely used her beauty to move through the world. I mean, she would never have had that chance with Leakey if she hadn't, been a little flirtatious. And so I mean, and Alice Waters too. They use their feminine wiles a teeny bit. I mean, and and Jacobs actually, in organizing the neighborhood, it was the time where people were very afraid. The Red Scare was still going on. People were very afraid of being branded as communists. So she had the children of the neighborhood wear these sandwich boards when she was trying to save Washington Square. It said "Save the Square," which is pretty funny because there's never any problem. There are always a lot of squares in the world. But these little kids would say, "Oh, please sign our petition," and they were cute. They were wearing the sandwich boards. So people who wouldn't have signed if it was, someone more official saying, "Will you sign this petition?" would sign for the kids. So she was pretty wily about. I mean, I kind of think of that as a feminine thing that she was willing to organize. Using psychology. I mean, maybe that's not a female quality. I may be wrong, but I do think that they, and also because they were outsiders, they did have a fresh perspective. They had nothing to protect, no institution. They didn't represent any institution. They didn't represent any theory, and so it really freed them up. And at that moment, to be sort of critical of the status quo actually was something that was going on in a lot of quarters in the early 60s.
Were you able to meet the women, and how did that go?
I met Alice Waters, and I was really lucky enough to interview her at her house. So I got to see her kitchen. And her kitchen was not some fancy designer kitchen. It was very simple. The chairs around her table didn't match. But one thing I really took note of was on one wall she had two open fireplaces where she does a lot of cooking evidently with her friends at home, and so she could cook like a leg of lamb over the fire, not one but two. Instead of two ovens, it was two open fireplaces. Her garden in the back was filled with herbs. When I got there, she made me a little pot of mint tea with fresh mint. It was the best mint tea I've ever had, and it was something about the fact that it had been picked, 5 minutes before. She was clearly really, really invested in every detail. The house was very spare, very beautiful. Kitchen was utilitarian. No bells and whistles for style. It was all about functionality. So I met her, and I met Jane Goodall, and I was telling this group earlier that I had no idea that getting an interview with Jane Goodall was like getting an interview with Mick Jagger. It was impossible. I was working on it for about a year and a half, talking to her handlers, and every time we seemed to settle on a date, it got changed. She's so much on the road all year long. It was very hard to have time, and I spoke to her for about 4 hours. It was really, really exciting. And I often say there was this odd little thing that happened. I was in the country, and I have a little writing cottage, like a little Thoreau's cottage. And after speaking to her, I was really, really excited and wanted to write my notes down. And I was sitting at my desk, which looks out on the window, and this huge fox walked up. I've never seen a fox right outside my window, and stared at me. And I thought, wow, there's Jane. There's the spirit of the animal. There was no, so the other two obviously are dead. So unfortunately, I did talk to Jane Jacobs' son. Went to Toronto and met him, and he's sort of a keeper of the stories. He had a lot of stories that I had never heard about Jane Jacobs and his memories of being in New York. So really 3 out of 4, I'd say.
One more question. One more question. Question from the audience. What choices do you make personally to live like these powerful women?
Well, that's a great one. One of the things that Jane Goodall said to me is, she said, we all feel politically impotent. We feel like we can't make a difference. What does it matter if you buy saran wrap or not? And she said, but if each person starts to live a little differently and consume a little less, if you think, do I really need this? Not do I want it? You might really want it. Do I really need this? Then you start consuming in a different way. And I have to say, I do think that. I think, do I really need this? Which maybe I wouldn't have thought. I'm definitely more of a foodie. I mean, I was always a foodie, but I really, really care about how the food is grown. I would never buy anything but an organic chicken. I buy organic meat. So I think my consumer habits in terms of food have changed a bit. And I do note when I'm in a city that works many of the things that Jane Jacobs said about a lively sidewalk. And when I was in Albany for an interview, and I was in a place, there'd been this little historic neighborhood, and there were suddenly superhighway going in. We've all been in this situation with about 3 superhighways going overarching the road. And it was so diminishing, and I kind of knew why I felt that way, and as a result of her. So I do think I look at cities differently. I know why I am impressed with St. Augustine or Rome or Paris versus Tucson.
That's not bad company. Okay.
I'm curious, what was the most interesting fact that you learned while researching that you hadn't expected?
Well, there is a fact, but it's not in the book. I'll tell it to you. So Jane Jacobs could talk to anyone, and she had noticed in the fight to save, they were trying to put a highway through Lower Manhattan, and she realized that at all the meetings, it was called Lomax, the highway, that in all the meetings there were all these mafia guys with hard hats, and she thought, this is really, it's going right through Little Italy. That's their neighborhood. Why would they want their own neighborhood flattened? So she thought, she remembered she had a school friend whose father was in the mafia in Scranton. She grew up in Scranton. So she called her friend and she said, do you think you could arrange for a meeting with Joey Bonanno, who was the head of one of the mafia families? So he did. And she and her friend were invited to Little Italy. So Jane arrived with her little white gloves and her little pocketbook, her little pearls, and she went up to Joey Bonanno's office and she talked about how important these neighborhoods were. It was going to wipe out a part of Chinatown. It was going to wipe out Little Italy. It was going to wipe out part of what now is Soho. And she said, you can put concrete down anywhere. Why are you doing it in this neighborhood? And he listened very patiently, and never were the guys with hard hats at those meetings again. So I wish I'd known it before the book, but that was pretty surprising. I mean, to go and talk to someone from Milwaukee was amazing. Yeah.
When you were writing Visionary Woman, who were you kind of writing to? What was the audience? Because as I look into the crowd, there's students, there's men, there's women, there's people that do art, political science. Who are you writing to?
I think I was writing to everyone. I in fact wish the women wasn't in the title, because I think women think it's just a book about women, but it's really about these extraordinary people who push back against convention and thought outside the box. And my original title was Accidental Revolutionary, but the publisher didn't like that. So I think I really wanted everyone to read it, but I wasn't really thinking about. I was just trying to get the story down. It's really hard to know who you're writing for, and it's also hard to know what you never want to talk down. Readers are smart, so you don't want to talk down to a reader, but you also don't want to assume that they know things they might not know. And I would have trouble sometimes remembering what I hadn't known when I started, which was I didn't know much really. So I'd have to recreate what I knew about Silent Spring and try to fill in the blanks. But I was in the dark a lot, including who my audience was.
With everything we know now about the climate crisis and just kind of the current state of the world, I can see how this book would be really inspiring to young people, potential scientists or activists to read. If people could have one takeaway after finishing this book, what would you hope that takeaway would be?
That one person can really make a difference, a really profound difference, and that all change is the long game, but that the way to facilitate change is to organize around something very specific, and then to start building a coalition of people, and that instead of thinking I have to solve a giant problem, that each one of us should focus on what we can do or what we can organize around in a very local way, because those things begin to grow. I mean, I don't think any of these women ever thought they would be icons. And one person really can make a difference, both good and bad. And these women, I think, the consciousness that they gave birth to, lives on and grows. And I think more and more people are green thinkers. And I think it's easy to be despairing. But I do think one person can make a difference. But it takes courage, tenacity, a kind of moral clarity. It's hard.
Isn't that a great message to end our night?
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, students. Thank you, professor. Thank you, audience, for your questions. Andrea, we have a nice little gift for you. It's a fancy new picture of the Ponte de Leon Hotel, now the center of Flagler College. Yes.
Oh, that's great.
I
Thank you
should
so
have mentioned
much.
that a year ago, Andrea spoke to a smaller group by Zoom. So that qualified as her first appearance with the forum. And that's when they gave her the Flagler line. So we're now year two.
Thank you so much.
And haven't we been lucky? Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really great